December 17th, 1895. A telegram races across the Atlantic from Washington to London. History books tell us this was about honor, about borders, about protecting the weak from the strong. They're lying to you. This wasn't about Venezuela. This was about money. This was about who owned the future cash flows of an entire hemisphere. The British Empire didn't retreat from the Americas because they were afraid of American soldiers. They retreated because their accountants ran the numbers and realized they couldn't afford the war. They didn't lose territory. They lost liquidity. And in the brutal arithmetic of empire, liquidity is everything. Let me paint you the picture of British power at its absolute zenith. The year is 1895, and 1/4 of the Earth's land mass is painted pink on the map. That pink represents the British Empire. From Cape Town to Calcutta, from Sydney to Singapore, the Union Jack flies over ports and prairies and mountain ranges. The Royal Navy commands the oceans with over 300 warships. No rival even comes close. London is not just a capital city. It is the central bank of the planet. Sterling is the reserve currency. The City of London clears 90% of global trade. British aristocrats sit in leather armchairs in clubs on Pall Mall, and they make decisions that determine the price of wheat in Kansas and rubber in Malaysia. They are the masters of the universe. They believe their supremacy is ordained by God and guaranteed by gunpowder. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The British Empire was stretched thin, dangerously thin. They had armies in India, fleets in the Mediterranean, garrisons in Africa, and colonial administrators scattered across 5 continents. Every year the cost of maintaining this global machine grew larger. Every year the profit margins grew thinner. The empire was becoming a victim of its own success. It was too big to defend and too expensive to maintain. And across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of monster was waking up. The United States had spent the 19th century devouring its own continent. They had slaughtered the indigenous nations. They had fought a civil war that killed 600,000 men. They had built railroads across deserts and prairies. By 1895, the American frontier was closed. There was nowhere left to expand internally. So the energy, the violence, the hunger that had driven the pioneers west was now turning outward. And it was turning south. Here's the trap that Britain walked into. They were addicted to empire. They needed colonies to supply raw materials and captive markets for their goods. But each new colony required soldiers and ships and administrators. Each new possession was a liability on the balance sheet that demanded constant investment. The British were running an empire on credit. They were borrowing from the future to pay for the present, and the future was about to foreclose. The antagonist in this story is not a general or a politician. The antagonist is the bond market. The antagonist is the cold logic of interest rates and debt service ratios. The antagonist is a simple question that British bankers were starting to ask. Can we afford to fight the United States over a jungle in South America? The answer was about to become brutally clear. The Venezuela crisis didn't start with high ideals. It started with gold. In the 1880s, prospectors discovered massive gold deposits in the Guiana highlands along the border between Venezuela and British Guiana. Suddenly, a patch of malarial jungle that nobody had cared about for a century was worth millions of pounds sterling. The British moved fast. They sent surveyors to redraw the maps. They pushed their territorial claims westward. deep into land that Venezuela considered sovereign territory. The Venezuelans protested. The British ignored them. Venezuela was weak, chaotic, perpetually on the edge of civil war. Britain was the most powerful empire in human history. There was no contest. Except Venezuela had one card left to play. They hired an American lobbyist named William Scruggs. Scruggs was a propaganda genius. He wrote a pamphlet with a title designed to detonate in Washington: British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He mailed it to every congressman, every senator, every newspaper editor in America. His argument was simple and inflammatory. The British are colonizing South America. They are violating the Monroe Doctrine. They are testing whether the United States is a real power or just a loud noise. The pamphlet landed in Washington at the exact moment when America was looking for a fight. The American economy in 1895 was a boiling cauldron of rage and energy. The Depression of 1893 had wiped out banks and railroads. Unemployment was catastrophic. There were strikes and riots in the streets. The country was angry, restless, and humiliated. American industrialists had built the largest steel industry on earth, the most extensive railway network, the most productive factories, but they had no outlet for their power. They had no empire. They had no colonies. They were rich, but they were not respected, and that psychological wound was festering. President Grover Cleveland needed a win. His Secretary of State was Richard Olney, a bulldog lawyer from Boston with a deep belief in American exceptionalism. Olney looked at the Venezuela dispute and saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to tell the British Empire that the Western Hemisphere now belonged to Washington. In July 1895, Olney drafted a diplomatic note to London. It was not a request. It was a declaration of war hidden in legal language. Olney wrote that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law. Let that phrase sink in. Its fiat is law. He was telling the British that in the Americas, American word was final. He demanded that Britain submit the border dispute to arbitration. He demanded a reply. The note landed on the desk of Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister. Salisbury was a relic of the Victorian age, a bearded aristocrat who believed the world was ordered and hierarchical, and fundamentally British. He read Olney's note and dismissed it as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine was not international law. It was just a unilateral American declaration. It had no standing in European courts. Salisbury made a fatal error. He let the note sit on his desk. He went on vacation. He assumed the Americans were just posturing for domestic consumption. He didn't realize that in Washington, patience was running out. 4 months passed. No reply came from London. To Cleveland and Olney, the silence was an insult. It was the British aristocracy looking down its nose at the American Republic. When Salisbury's reply finally arrived in November, it was a lecture. He dismantled Olney's arguments point by point. He refused arbitration. He refused to budge on the border. The tone was polite, but the message was absolute. Mind your own business. December 17th, 1895. Grover Cleveland walked into the chamber of the United States Congress and dropped a bomb. He asked Congress to fund an American commission to investigate the Venezuela border. That sounded reasonable. Then he said that once the commission determined the true border, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any British appropriation of territory. Every means in its power. that means war. The chamber erupted in applause. Republicans and Democrats who had been at each other's throats for years united overnight. The press went insane. Headlines screamed war with England and twist the lion's tail. The Irish-American community, which hated Britain with a passion, celebrated in the streets. Militia regiments began drilling. Stock markets panicked. The United States was preparing to fight the Royal Navy. Think about the scale of that. Think about the audacity. In London, the news hit like a thunderbolt. The British public was bewildered. They had barely been paying attention to Venezuela. Suddenly they were reading that the President of the United States was threatening to invade Canada. The initial reaction was shock and contempt. The Americans must be bluffing. They don't have the Navy to challenge us. But then the British Admiralty started running the war games. They started calculating what it would actually cost to fight the United States. The numbers were terrifying. Yes, the Royal Navy was larger, but British ships were scattered across the globe, protecting trade routes. To concentrate the fleet in the Atlantic meant leaving India and Egypt and Singapore exposed. And the Americans had geography on their side. They were uninvadable. The British Army was tiny. Canada had a 4,000-mile border with the United States that was impossible to defend. If war broke out, American troops would be in Montreal within 2 weeks. There was nothing Britain could do to stop them. But the real killer wasn't military, it was financial. On December 20th, 1895, Wall Street crashed. It became known as Black Friday. British investors held billions of dollars in American railroad bonds and industrial stocks. The threat of war triggered a liquidation panic. Everyone tried to sell at once. The market collapsed. The liquidity of the London financial system, the beating heart of British power, started to seize up. British banks held massive exposure to American debt. If war came, those bonds would default. The city of London would be wiped out. The financial elite sent a clear message to the government. We cannot afford this war. Let me give you specific numbers so you understand the scale. British investors held over $4 billion in American securities in 1895. That's roughly $140 billion in today's money. A war would vaporize that wealth overnight. Britain's national debt was already £700 million. Fighting the United States would double it. The interest payments alone would bankrupt the Treasury. The accountants ran the numbers, and the conclusion was inescapable. Sovereignty is solvency, and Britain could not afford to stay solvent and fight America at the same time. Then fate intervened. January 2nd, 1896. News reached London of a disaster in South Africa. A British adventurer named Leander Starr Jameson had launched a botched raid into the Boer Republic of Transvaal. The Jameson raid was a humiliating failure. The raiders were captured. But what happened next changed everything. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a telegram to the Boer president, congratulating him on defeating the British without foreign help. The Kruger telegram was an insult. It implied that Germany might support the Boers militarily. The British public exploded in rage. All the anger that had been directed at America suddenly pivoted to Germany. The newspapers forgot about Venezuela and screamed about the German threat. For Lord Salisbury, this was a lifeline. He could now back down on Venezuela without looking weak. He could say Britain had to focus on the real threat in Europe. It was a face-saving exit, but make no mistake, it was an exit. It was a retreat. February 1896. The British government quietly signaled to Washington that they would accept arbitration. It was the blink. After months of saying never, they said yes. They agreed to submit the border dispute to a neutral tribunal. They accepted the premise that the United States had the right to intervene in South American affairs. To save face, the British insisted on one condition. Any settlers who had lived in the disputed territory for 50 years could stay regardless of where the line was drawn. The Americans agreed. It was a fig leaf. Everyone knew what had happened. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced at gunpoint. The arbitration tribunal met in Paris in 1899. The panel awarded Britain 90% of the disputed territory. The gold mines stayed in British hands. On paper, Britain won. But in reality, they lost everything that mattered. The specific location of the border was irrelevant. What mattered was the precedent. Britain had acknowledged that Washington was the supreme authority in the Western Hemisphere. They had acknowledged that they could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. The ledger had spoken. The psychological impact on the British ruling class was profound and immediate. They called it the Great Rapprochement. It was a cold-blooded strategic pivot. British planners looked at the map and saw Germany rising in Europe, Russia expanding in Asia, and the United States industrializing at a terrifying pace. They realized they could not fight everyone at once. They had to choose their enemies. So they made a calculated decision. They would befriend the one power they could not defeat. The United States. This wasn't sentimentality. This was survival. Over the next decade, Britain systematically liquidated its strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere and handed them to Washington. The first sacrifice was the Panama Canal. For 50 years, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had guaranteed that any canal across Central America would be a joint British-American project. In 1901, the United States demanded exclusive control. They wanted to build it, own it, and fortify it. Britain just folded. They signed the Hay-Paunce-Foot Treaty and gave away the most strategic waterway on Earth. No compensation. No concessions. They just handed it over. Then came the military withdrawal. The Royal Navy's North America and West Indies Squadron had patrolled the Caribbean for 2 centuries. It was the symbol of British power in the Americas. In the early 1900s, Admiral Jackie Fisher recalled the squadron. He scrapped the old gunboats. He brought the battleships home to face Germany. The British bases in Jamaica and Bermuda were hollowed out. The garrisons were reduced. Britain essentially demilitarized its frontier with the United States. They made a calculated bet. They didn't need to defend the Americas anymore because the Americans were now the police force. The power vacuum was filled immediately. 1898. The United States launched the Spanish-American War. They kicked Spain out of Cuba and seized Puerto Rico and the Philippines. It was naked imperial expansion. And Britain? Britain cheered them on. While France and Germany sympathized with Spain, Britain encouraged Washington. The British press celebrated American victories. British diplomats kept the other European powers from interfering. It was the dawn of a partnership. Britain was outsourcing hemispheric security to Washington. 1902. Venezuela was in trouble again. The dictator Cipriano Castro refused to pay his debts to European banks. Britain, Germany, and Italy sent warships to blockade the coast. They shelled a few forts. President Theodore Roosevelt watched with deep suspicion. He didn't mind Europeans collecting debts, but he worried Germany might use the crisis as an excuse to seize territory. Roosevelt issued a warning. He announced the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He said the United States would act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. If a Latin American country misbehaved, the U.S. would intervene so the Europeans wouldn't have to. He quietly told the Germans to back off, and he told the British to. The British reaction was immediate. They pulled their ships back. They deferred to Roosevelt. Prime Minister Arthur Balfour publicly welcomed American dominance in the region. It was a complete reversal. In 7 years, Britain had gone from threatening war over a borderline to inviting the Americans to run the continent. The consequences of that rapprochement shaped the 20th century. When World War I erupted in 1914, Britain was financially spent within 2 years. It survived on American loans, American steel, American wheat, American money. By 1917, Britain owed the United States over $4 billion. Without American entry, Britain would have faced peace on German terms. The special relationship, born in the humiliation of 1895, saved Britain from defeat, but not from decline. The torch didn't pass in ceremony. It changed hands in a ledger. Empire ended when the balance sheet said it must. For Venezuela, the victory came with a price. British expansion was stopped, but American dominance replaced it. Washington would shape Venezuela's politics, its borders, and its oil industry for the next century. The lesson was harsh and permanent. The Monroe Doctrine was never about protecting Latin America from empire. It was about ensuring only one empire ruled the hemisphere. Venezuela didn't escape imperialism. It merely changed masters. Only the flag was different. Today, a thin line cuts through jungle between Guyana and Venezuela. It looks insignificant on a map, but that line marks a turning point in world history. This is where the 19th century ended, where the British Lion stepped back, and where the United States discovered it could command global outcomes without firing a shot, not through armies, but through economics. Because sovereignty follows solvency. And by 1895, America could afford power in ways Britain no longer could. The Venezuela crisis of 1895 is the forgotten prelude to the American century. No battles were fought, yet an empire retreated. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere, but gained survival. It was humiliating, but brilliant. In the ruthless arithmetic of empire, survival is victory. The ledger decides history. Cash flows decide power. And in 1895, that power quietly passed from Britain to the United States and never looked back. History is not decided by flags or speeches. It is decided by interest rates and debt ratios and the cold arithmetic of who can afford to stay in the game. The British Empire had been playing on borrowed time and borrowed money. The bill came due in December 1895, and they paid it by surrendering the Americas. That's the truth they don't teach you in school. That's the story behind the story. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve, if you want to understand how the world really works, subscribe now. Because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the ledger for what it really is. The only scoreboard that matters.